By the end of this video, you'll understand how a single letter written by a soldier on the Western Front quietly contradicted a belief that millions of people had accepted during World War I. At the time, civilians were told that conditions at the front were organized, controlled, and strategically effective. Official reports described disciplined operations, steady progress, and manageable hardship. But one letter described something very different. It revealed confusion, exhaustion, and disorder that did not appear in public accounts. And once this account was compared with other private correspondence, the belief that the war was being fought under stable conditions could no longer hold. This is the story of how that belief failed. To understand why this letter mattered, it's important to understand what people believed about the war in France. From newspapers to government bulletins, information about the front followed a consistent pattern. Reports emphasized coordination, heroism, and strategic purpose. Losses were framed as necessary. Setbacks were minimized. The message was clear. Despite hardship, the war was being managed effectively. This belief reassured families, justified sacrifice, and sustained public support. It suggested that suffering had direction and meaning. The myth endured because it aligned with visible institutions. Armies were organized. Officers issued commands, supply systems functioned. Maps showed planned movements. From a distance, the war appeared structured. Most civilians had no direct access to frontline conditions. Their understanding depended on filtered information. When that information was consistent, it felt reliable. The belief did not rely on detailed evidence. It relied on trust in authority. During World War I, information was tightly controlled. Censorship offices reviewed correspondence. Journalists operated under restrictions. Photographs and reports were selected carefully. Material that undermined morale was discouraged or removed. This control was justified as necessary for national security and unity. As a result, the public encountered a curated version of the war, one that emphasized resilience over disruption. For years, this system functioned without visible challenge. Families received letters that passed inspection. Newspapers followed official guidance. Public ceremonies reinforced the narrative of order and purpose. Nothing in everyday life forced people to reconsider what they had been told. The belief persisted not because it was constantly proven, but because nothing publicly contradicted it. That contradiction would come not through official investigation, but through one personal account that escaped simplification and forced private readers to see the war differently. One of the strongest forces sustaining the battlefield myth was systematic censorship. During World War I, military authorities monitored correspondence and reporting closely. Letters from soldiers were reviewed before delivery. Journalists were restricted in what they could observe and publish. Sensitive details were removed or softened. This process did not aim to fabricate stories. It aimed to limit disruption. By filtering out descriptions of confusion, mismanagement, and severe hardship, censorship produced a consistent public narrative. What reached civilians emphasized stability and competence. The absence of disturbing detail became evidence of control. Most civilians had no alternative sources of information. They relied on newspapers, government bulletins, and public speeches. These channels were interconnected. Reports circulated between agencies and publications, reinforcing similar interpretations. When multiple outlets presented the same perspective, it appeared confirmed. Independent verification was impossible for most families. Distance, cost, and restrictions made direct observation unattainable. Trust in official channels became the only practical option. Beyond structural control, psychological need played an important role. Millions of families had relatives at the front. Accepting that conditions were chaotic or unsafe would have increased anxiety without offering solutions. Reassuring narratives reduced fear and allowed daily life to continue. Believing in order and progress made sacrifice feel purposeful. Doubt, by contrast, created helplessness. As a result, comforting explanations were more readily accepted than troubling ones. Public expression of doubt carried social risk. Criticism of official accounts could be interpreted as weakening morale or disrespecting soldiers. In many communities, unity was emphasized as a civic duty. This discouraged open questioning. Even when individuals privately noticed inconsistencies, they rarely voiced them publicly. Silence preserved cohesion, and cohesion reinforced belief. Another reason the belief endured was physical separation. The Western Front was distant and inaccessible. Travel was restricted. Photographs were selective. First-hand observation by civilians was virtually impossible. Without visibility, imagination filled the gap. Maps, statistics, and summaries replaced lived experience. These abstractions conveyed scale but not conditions. They suggested control without revealing complexity. Most importantly, doubts remained isolated. One family might receive a troubling letter. Another might hear an unsettling rumor. Another might notice contradictions in reporting. But these observations were not connected. Without collective discussion, concerns stayed private. Fragmented doubt rarely challenges dominant narratives. As long as reassurance remained consistent and alternative accounts remained scattered, the battlefield myth held firm. Not because it was thoroughly tested, but because it was never forced into confrontation. Long before one letter gained attention, soldiers had been writing home about daily life at the front. Some described long periods without clear orders. Others mentioned shortages, delayed supplies, and confusion during movements. A few wrote about exhaustion and uncertainty that contradicted official optimism. These accounts did not circulate widely. They remained within families, read quietly, and discussed cautiously. Without public confirmation, they were treated as personal impressions rather than evidence. Although correspondence was reviewed, censorship was not perfect. Some details passed through unintentionally. Others were written in indirect language that avoided obvious removal. Soldiers learned to communicate hardship without stating it openly. As a result, fragments of reality entered private letters. But fragments rarely form conclusions on their own. Without broader context, these hints were easy to overlook or reinterpret. Over time, some families noticed discrepancies. Official reports spoke of progress and coordination. Letters spoke of waiting, confusion, and disrupted plans. Newspapers emphasized momentum. Private correspondence described uncertainty. These contradictions were subtle. Each could be explained individually: exaggeration, stress, misinterpretation, or temporary difficulty. No single account was strong enough to challenge the dominant narrative. When letters raised concern, recipients often softened their meaning. Families assumed soldiers were shielding loved ones from worry. They attributed negative descriptions to fatigue or emotional strain. They focused on hopeful passages rather than troubling ones. This reinterpretation was protective. It preserved emotional stability and maintained alignment with public narratives. Accepting troubling details at face value would have required questioning everything else. Some letters circulated beyond immediate families. Friends shared passages, neighbors exchanged stories, small networks compared experiences. These exchanges created pockets of doubt. But these networks were limited. Without access to broader platforms, local conversations could not challenge national narratives. Doubt remained contained within private spaces. By the time the pivotal letter appeared, similar accounts already existed. Descriptions of disorder, fatigue, and confusion had been written many times. What was missing was not testimony. It was recognition. No single letter had yet been seen as representative. Each was treated as isolated experience. The belief remained intact because these fragments had not been assembled into a coherent picture. That alignment was approaching. The letter that shifted understanding did not arrive as a warning. It came through the same channels as thousands of others. It passed inspection. It was folded, stamped, and delivered in the usual way. To the postal system, it was unremarkable. To its recipient, it initially appeared no different from previous correspondence. Nothing about its arrival suggested that it would challenge what people believed about the war. What distinguished this letter was not emotion. It was precision. The soldier described movements that had failed, orders that arrived too late, and positions that had changed without coordination. He noted dates, locations, and sequences of events. He explained how planned advances dissolved into uncertainty. These were not general complaints. They were structured accounts. Each detail corresponded with timelines and outcomes already known publicly, but never explained privately. When the recipient compared this letter with others received earlier, patterns became visible. Descriptions of waiting matched previous hints of delay. Accounts of confusion matched earlier remarks about poor coordination. References to shortages aligned with earlier concerns. What had once seemed isolated now appeared consistent. The letter did not introduce new hardship. It organized existing evidence. Unlike earlier letters, this one resisted reinterpretation. It did not exaggerate. It did not dramatize. It did not appeal for sympathy. Its tone was restrained and factual. This made dismissal difficult. Stress, fear, or fatigue could no longer explain away the contradictions. The letter presented conditions as routine, not exceptional. The belief that disorder was temporary no longer fit the record. At this point, the battlefield myth could no longer explain what families were reading. The idea of coordinated, controlled warfare conflicted with consistent descriptions of improvisation and uncertainty. Public optimism no longer matched private evidence. There was no announcement that the belief had failed. It simply stopped making sense. The collapse occurred in living rooms and kitchens as readers adjusted their understanding without public discussion. No newspaper reported that perceptions were changing. No official corrected previous statements. But among those who saw the letter in context, trust in official accounts weakened. Interpretation shifted from acceptance to evaluation. The letter did not undermine morale publicly. It reshaped belief privately. After the letter reshaped understanding, there was no public acknowledgement that the battlefield narrative had failed. Newspapers continued publishing official summaries. Government bulletins maintained familiar language. Public ceremonies reinforced themes of endurance and purpose. From the outside, nothing appeared to change, but privately, interpretation shifted. The letter did not remain confined to one household. Excerpts were shared with relatives, neighbors, and close friends. Passages were read aloud. Copies were sometimes made by hand. Similar letters were brought forward for comparison. This circulation was limited and cautious. It occurred within trusted networks, where speaking openly carried less social risk. As more accounts were compared, conversations changed. Families became more attentive to details in correspondence. Official reports were read alongside letters rather than accepted alone. Reassuring language was weighed against first-hand descriptions. Doubt did not become public protest. It became private awareness. Authorities remained attentive to morale. Postal inspections intensified. Journalistic restrictions were reinforced. Messaging emphasized unity and progress. Efforts focused on preventing unofficial accounts from gaining visibility. These actions did not erase private knowledge. They limited its reach. Despite growing private skepticism, public narratives persisted. Many families avoided open discussion. Questioning official accounts publicly risked social isolation. Others believed that voicing doubt could harm soldiers' morale. Silence protected relationships and stability. As a result, the official story remained dominant, even as confidence in it weakened. The most significant consequence was not confrontation. It was reinterpretation. People no longer assumed that official reports fully described conditions. They read between lines. They searched letters for indirect meaning. They compared sources quietly. The battlefield myth had collapsed. What replaced it was not certainty, but caution. The collapse of the battlefield myth revealed how it had been maintained without constant fabrication. It did not depend on inventing events. It depended on selecting which events were visible. Reports emphasized coordination and success. Disruption and failure were treated as exceptions rather than patterns. This selective visibility created a coherent story from incomplete information. The system did not lie continuously. It filtered continuously. Another revelation lay in the tension between morale and accuracy. Authorities believed that sustaining public confidence was essential to maintaining military effectiveness. Information was shaped to preserve resolve and unity. Accuracy became secondary. This prioritization was rarely stated openly. It operated as an assumption that partial truth served a greater purpose than full disclosure. The letter exposed the cost of this assumption. Private correspondence was treated as unreliable. Letters were subjective, emotional, and inconsistent. Official reports were standardized and institutional. When contradictions appeared, institutional sources were trusted over individual voices. This hierarchy mattered. It allowed first-hand experience to be discounted without investigation. Personal accounts were considered exceptions rather than evidence. The story also revealed the role of fragmentation. Each soldier experienced only a small section of the front. Each family received only a few letters. Each newspaper reported limited details. No single channel provided a complete picture. Fragmentation prevented synthesis. Without synthesis, belief remained stable. The pivotal letter mattered because it enabled connection. The battlefield myth endured because it simplified uncertainty. Accepting that the war was chaotic and poorly coordinated would have required reinterpreting sacrifice, loss, and purpose. The official narrative offered clarity and meaning. Belief reduced psychological strain. As long as it functioned emotionally and socially, there was little incentive to question it. Finally, the story revealed a recurring pattern. In high-pressure systems, information becomes managed. Complexity is reduced. Contradictions are dispersed. Trust replaces verification. Beliefs persist until fragments are aligned. The letter did not introduce disorder. It introduced coherence. After the letter reshaped private understanding, public life continued largely unchanged. Newspapers maintained official language. Public events emphasized endurance. Recruitment and production proceeded. The visible structure of wartime society remained intact. From the outside, confidence appeared stable. But privately, interpretation had shifted. There was no formal acknowledgement that the battlefield narrative had been incomplete. No official statement revisited earlier claims. No broad explanation addressed the gap between public reports and private correspondence. The record absorbed contradiction without revising itself. Silence preserved continuity. Among families and close communities, awareness persisted. Letters were reread differently. New correspondence was interpreted cautiously. Official reports were no longer accepted without comparison. The lesson did not become public knowledge. It became private practice. This story matters not because it exposed one inaccurate report, but because it shows how belief systems endure under pressure. Information was shaped to preserve morale. Complexity was simplified. Contradiction was dispersed. The myth collapsed only when fragments were aligned through personal testimony. No investigation achieved this. No public debate achieved this. It happened through quiet reading and comparison. The soldier's letter did not end the war. It did something quieter. It revealed how distance and authority can separate people from lived experience. And it showed that belief persists not because it is always reinforced, but because it is rarely tested. The battlefield myth did not fall publicly. It quietly stopped explaining the world.